Welcome to the corner of Morris and Queen. My name's Chris Green. I'm the owner of Atlantic News. Really happy to have Deny Sullivan here with us. Deny, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, Deny is an economist, and we're going to talk about some of the issues here in Halifax, whether it's transportation, housing. Also, there was an article just recently in the local newspaper, or what's left of the newspaper, talking about the title of the article was How Canada, the title of the series is How Canada Wins. And among some other individuals, Deny was had some pieces in there, so we'll talk about that. But first, Deny, tell us a little bit about yourself. What brought you to the dismal science? Are you from here, and where'd you do your studies, and what's your gig besides your blog?
Yeah. So thank you for having me on. I usually describe myself as half Maritime or half Albertan. I grew up in the Maritimes, and then my mom worked for an oil company, so we moved back and forth from Calgary a couple times. Went to school, or to university at St. FX, and got my master's at the University of Calgary, so again, a cross-country split. And I got into economics very randomly. I vividly remember the day my mom came home one day with a book about economics and said, I thought that you might like this, because I didn't know that I wanted to go into business like my older brothers. I liked politics, but I wasn't sure I wanted to get that much into it. And I also liked history, but it's not a great job market for historians.
Well, economics covers all of those, as you know.
So it was kind of the blend there. So that just kind of came naturally.
Nice. I taught economics for a while, and there's a couple of descriptions of it that I particularly like that I would always pass on to students. The Woody Allen definition: economics is the study of money and why it's good. The old saw, I first heard about it by the head of the Fed, who he got it from someone, where the economist's job is to go to a party, and just as people are having fun, you take the punch bowl away.
Yeah.
Right. And then a little more biting line about economists is that they know the price of everything but the value of nothing. You've probably heard all of those, but
yeah. That last one can be very true, for sure.
Right. Well, when I first came here, I started looking for ways to educate myself on local economics, and there's all sorts of people writing about whole country, and you were one of the few individuals that I found regularly writes stuff about the economics here. I notice in your blog, Deny's
Denny's Substack?
Yeah, Denny's Substack. Now, is Denny's restaurant a thing in Canada like it is in the U.S.?
It is out west.
Okay.
It is out west, so yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I grew up with Denny's. Those are the ones that are open 24 hours, right? Yeah. So besides the blog, what do you have a full-time gig as well, or is this your full-time gig?
Yeah, so the blog is just a passion project, a side thing.
Mm-hmm.
My day job is helping big investors buy toll roads. So I did this work for a few years in Ontario, working for a big asset manager, and they bought a whole bunch of infrastructure assets. And then a couple of years ago, split off with some coworkers to start our own little firm that focused on toll roads and railroads to a lesser extent. Basically, we just guess how many cars are going to be on the road, and then the price is usually set by the government.
Okay.
But you multiply those two together and you get revenue. It's not really a thing in Canada because we don't have many toll roads, and it's getting lower and lower every day.
Where are these toll roads that you're doing your business?
Yeah, so a lot of it is in Latin America, like a lot of in Brazil, Mexico. Basically, every highway will be tolled. There's quite a bit in Europe, Southern Europe. There's a lot of action in India. So it's a broad mix of countries. There's some in the U.S. as well. But it's basically a pretty global
Sure.
business.
Yeah, I've living in the States and living abroad, I've come across a lot of toll roads. That's going to come up in our discussion today, because a lot of people would argue toll roads are a good thing because it charges the people that actually use that road.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about bridge tolls and different pieces like that. So great. This article in the Chronicle Herald last weekend, the first in the series, How Canada Wins, talks about the challenges that Nova Scotia particularly is facing: inflation, housing shortage, wait list of doctors, transportation. Now the tariffs from the orange-skinned one. Some interesting economic pieces that came out of this that surprised me. The first one, maybe not so much. I've learned about this as I've been here. 70% of Nova Scotia exports go to the United States. That seems pretty much in line with Canada as a whole, would you say?
Yes, except there is, a lot of people have done some really good work on comparing different parts of Canada in terms of exposures. Nova Scotia ranks lower on those lists.
It does, okay. Even though 70%. Wow.
Even though we do export a lot to the U.S., we aren't that much of a big exporter. We have some staple industries, Michelin tires, there's pulp mills, but we don't have anything like the oil sands.
Or Ontario and all the automobiles.
Or even in the Maritimes, St. John has the refinery.
Yes.
And that serves New England, and so that's a huge exposure for them. Nova Scotia still, obviously we're exposed, but I think the better way to think about it is we're exposed in the way that we are reliant on Ontario doing well and on Quebec doing well. Like, we are all in this together. Even if our specific direct exposure is a bit less than other places in the country.
Okay. Another interesting stat that surprised me, but maybe there are reasons to unpack this, that Nova Scotia has the lowest GDP per capita of all of the 50 states in the United States and all of the 10 provinces.
Yeah.
Now, I've traveled in Alabama and Mississippi, and I can tell you the poverty that I've seen down there, I don't see that around Nova Scotia. So some of this must be about how it's come up with, and maybe the going from Canadian dollar to U.S. dollar, some of these comparisons, because that, while I know that Nova Scotia is not in terms of GDP in Canada, it's not the largest. That's an interesting statistic that they led with in the newspaper article.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, the GDP statistics are what they are. We don't perform well on that. But GDP is just an aggregate number, right?
Sure, and it has all sorts of flaws. Yeah.
But it's still super helpful. But I think what you're getting at is that there are ways in which Canada does a better job at spreading that GDP around.
Quality of life, exactly.
And the U.S. is, I would say, a bit famous for not doing as much redistribution.
Well, the gap between the rich and the poor is much higher there. Yeah.
Yeah.
The article mentioned that Nova Scotia, that the GDP here is growing because of immigration. I've heard that Canada-wide. So Nova Scotia must be fit in with the overall Canadian story there. That under Trudeau, the immigration really came up, and so that increase in GDP the last 10 years, if you unpack it, it's really it doesn't have to do with productivity or Canada really going gangbusters. It was just more individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes you can overreact to a year of bad GDP numbers, but 10 years is a long time, and you want to see that number go up. You want to see that GDP per capita go up, because that's what kind of sets the baseline of living standards.
So I haven't seen much of this, but would we say the last couple of years Canada has it officially been in recession, where the GDP has decreased 2 quarters in a row?
No, it wouldn't be, because the
that
population
low
growth has been too strong.
Okay.
So that is there have been a bunch of federal immigration changes, which could lead to slight declines in population over the next coming years.
But so far, the immigration has kept the GDP up, so there's no official recession. Right,
exactly.
Right. So the article starts off by saying decisions made here in Nova Scotia that have made living in Halifax deeply unaffordable. They've limited development. They've left Nova Scotia reliant on expensive imported energy. What have been these decisions that have been made that were so bad?
Well, everybody can have their own take on this,
sure.
And I've got mine. But just to set the scene a bit, I think you mentioned Nova Scotia having a very low GDP per capita within North America. I think part of that is that we are a small province that's quite far away from the rest of the action.
Right.
And here in Halifax, we're a small city in a small province, and there's just a difficulty of getting scale in anything. And so that's why it feels like we're paying crazy high taxes and not getting much. And also, we're also very reliant on the federal government for through transfer payments. I think the answer to that is to grow and try to establish that kind of scale. Also, growth is just good in general. But when I look at the economy, the biggest sources of restrictions are around housing.
Housing, transportation goes along with that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
transportation is very closely linked to housing. Transportation is in some ways trickier. It's harder to build new highways.
In a city that's hundreds of years old and
Yes.
built for carriages, yes,
Yes.
yeah, many troubles.
But when you look on the housing side, it doesn't seem that difficult, because actually, municipally especially, we have all of these rules that restrict how much housing we can build in different parts of the city. And I think that those rules are effective at limiting how much housing we build in different parts of
Right,
the city.
and certain interests, of course, support these limitations. So you mentioned that there's two elements to the housing process, the issue. A lack of supply, we need to build more supply, and then the affordability issue, right? So what's happening with this now? 6 months ago, there was this Housing Accelerator Fund, and there was a whole lot of discussions about this. In this part of the city, a whole lot of people very much against. People coming out with practically pitchforks and saying not in not in my backyard, and not in so many words. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to speak with Frank Palermo, who was very. You might have come across Frank in some of these discussions.
I've seen it.
Yeah. And Frank very passionately talks about how this HRM wasn't a good. The Accelerator Fund was not a good fit here. Where are we with this Accelerator Fund? It basically wanted to increase density, particularly in places like the South End. But from what I understand, some of your work, were there some waivers done so that the areas around SMU and Dow, that the idea to really increase density, those weren't included? Or help me out with how it settled and where we are with that now.
Yeah. So the Housing Accelerator Fund was a federal program. It was basically a cash for reforms system.
Right.
So it wasn't intended to build any housing itself.
It gives incentive for the city to build more houses.
Yes.
Yeah.
The federal government shows up, says, here's a check, and we want you to rewrite your rules to allow more housing. That's the state that we're at in our dynamic here.
And we're not alone. There's a lot of places in Canada.
Everywhere in Canada.
Yeah, right.
It's always the same problem.
Right.
The municipalities need to be coerced, bribed. They in many ways refuse to allow the housing that we need.
Right. No, and I remember there was the arguments back and forth about whether this was a good idea. What was decided, and where is it now?
Yeah. So it did pass in Halifax. We're getting, I think it was last July.
And the meaning that a single home you could build up to 4 units.
Yeah. So there were a bunch of changes. The biggest ones was that everywhere in the city where you could build a single family home, you could now put 4 units on.
Okay, so that passed. So are we starting to see results of this yet?
There is some evidence. It's still very early, but this gets to some of the challenges about those zoning changes. Is that if you've got an already built home, demolishing it to build a 4-unit home at today's costs, that we don't know if that actually makes sense economically.
And it doesn't make sense for the community, right? You have people that live in a community, and you don't want to tear down houses and right away put in apartment buildings, right?
Yeah, although I would argue that success in this looks like 1 out of every 10 homes changing over a decade. Yeah. That is success. And so
so are we waiting to see the results of this? So now it's just if individuals that want to take this on.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues, is that we don't have an industry of these builders because it hasn't been allowed. Sort of like the province is trying to allow more resource development. But we don't have resource companies because we've never had resource development. So you're kind of just trying to kickstart an industry from scratch.
And there's no data, so yeah.
And so it's a very tricky thing. But so there was another part about the Accelerator Fund that was about allowing more density on basically major streets. Mm-hmm. Think of that as Roby or Wise Road in Dartmouth.
Right.
Sort of these corridors, bumping those levels up from often 3 to 5 stories to 7 to 9 stories. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of this barbell strategy. But to your point, as somebody who cares a lot about housing, the final Housing Accelerator Fund changes, I think, really missed the mark in one specific way by not really changing much of the zoning around our universities and our hospitals.
Where the housing is needed. You have people driving into these places.
Well, exactly. We have this this great opportunity in the South End where we have huge job centers in our universities and our hospitals. We have young people who would like to live near there, and walk to work. These communities are already extremely walkable, on
Right.
par with other major cities in Canada where you have subways and such.
Yes.
And yet, when you look around, basically a lot of we basically mandate single-family housing around those universities.
By the existing rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big mistake. And if you, replaced it with something like allowing 7-story buildings, those are zoning changes that we can be much more confident that will generate actual buildings in the future.
Right, right. Now, isn't this happening when I feel like I drive around Halifax, a city I've only lived in for a year. Practically every other street corner is a high-rise going up.
Yeah.
Now, aren't all of these, now I know they're not available yet, but aren't these going to lead to an increase in supply and help bring the price down? Or does this start to verge on the other issue you talked about, the affordability issue?
So I do think that the buildings will matter. Sometimes it can be a bit, it can be a bit deceptive when you see big buildings. And then, you can do the math and actually it's not that many units. Because we used to build entire neighborhoods. I always like the stat that after the McDonald Bridge was built in 1956, within 5 years, the population of Dartmouth tripled from 20,000 to 60,000. And you still see a lot of those homes there today.
Right.
A lot of those homes are from the post-war era, where we were building a lot of these single-family homes.
And the piece in the Chronicle Herald mentions that after World War II, Halifax and Nova Scotia were facing very similar issues with what we're facing today. But back in the 50s, the safety valve was building over in Dartmouth.
Yeah.
That's already been done.
Well, exactly.
Right.
The big difference is that we don't have as much land that's readily available. Yeah. And on the transportation...
Near the cities.
Well, exactly. On the transportation front, every home that you add outside of basically the peninsula, you are adding another car on the road. 90% of people outside of the peninsula drive to work. And so that's a challenge when those people, even if you can house them outside of the city in some further suburb, if they're driving in, they're hitting the same bottlenecks that we're already struggling with. So that's another reason why we need to focus on putting more housing, much more housing, in the areas where you can walk, bus, bike to work.
And now the rules are such that there's more flexibility to do that. Is that right? Particularly here in the South End?
Yeah, I'm not totally stoked about how far we've gone. I think there's a lot more you could do, especially here in the South End.
It's a step, though. Huh?
But it's a big step. And to your earlier point about these buildings coming up, we have a lot of big buildings underway. There's I think 12,000 units under construction.
Wow.
It's a huge amount, and I think this is the year where you'll start to see them actually start to deliver.
Well, we've seen rents start, if not plateauing, dropping a little bit, right? So the pressure has alleviated. Now, part of that might be with the immigration issue and less people coming in, but also just a little bit more supply slowly coming onto the market. Perhaps.
For sure. It's hard to decipher this,
Yes.
Especially in real time. Across the country, we're seeing, the rents, if you wanted to go get an apartment today, the rents are falling in major cities. I would expect, smaller cities to follow. And, I think there is an opportunity for over the next year for this supply-demand balance to become better, because we are delivering, we should be delivering record amounts of units, completing them.
Right. And when we say better, it means offerings for all different income levels, but particularly affordable pieces so that people can get in on the bottom end. Yep.
Yeah, you'd hope so. I mean, that's always a challenge. But I do think that at some point you run out of people who are willing to pay or willing or able to pay $2,000 a month for a unit.
Right.
And, when you start to bring in 3,000 or 5,000 of these new units online.
At 2,000, well, the way the market works is if they sit, the price goes down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But that takes a while.
Yeah, but it's very expensive. If you're a landlord, you probably understand that it's very expensive to keep a rental unit empty and not collect that rent. So hopefully you might start to get desperate. But I think at the very least, we should be hoping to, at the very minimum, get away from, going to see a unit or a place and there being a lineup of 12 people outside who are also hoping to get the same unit. I think that's just a huge problem that we've got to address. And I wouldn't declare victory by any means, but this year hopefully should be an improvement.
Yeah, and another aspect of this housing issue, and you wrote about it in your blog recently, the capped assessment program. I need some help with this one. As I was reading it, and then this did pop up, I grew up in California, and I grew up in the crater of Proposition 13.
Yep.
This was the Jarvis-Gann Amendment tax. The 70s prices were going up. People that lived in homes were being priced out of homes. And so this Prop 13 put a cap on the price, on the tax of houses going up. But what it did over the years, and I saw this being a public school educator, it ruined public schools because there was less funding for everything else, and it made it very, very difficult for young people to get into the housing market.
Yeah.
And it sure seems that today we have a similar situation where, and this is not a good guy, bad guy. Just because somebody has owned their house for 25 years, they're not the bad guy, of course, but it sure seems like, and I need some help with this, that established homeowners are making out, and really it's at the expense of younger homeowners that are trying to get in.
Yeah, that's clearly the situation that's emerged, especially in the past couple of years.
So what is this capped assessment program, and is there any movement on changing it?
So I haven't heard of any movement on changing anything.
This was a provincial piece. It was put in 2008. I understand.
It is a provincial policy. So basically what it does is that the province does assessments on all properties to determine your property tax bill. But what it says is that we're going to override your assessment and make it so that you have a taxable assessment. And that taxable assessment, if you are a Nova Scotian who owns their home, or also 1 to 4 unit rental properties, your taxable assessment will only go up by the rate of inflation.
Right.
And so it's still possible, your bill can also change depending on if the municipality changes their rate.
Right. And with the inflation here in Nova Scotia, those tax rates have gone up.
The tax bills have gone up.
The tax bills have gone up
by about 20%.
20%.
Basically, the rate of inflation since COVID.
Right. But you mentioned in one of your pieces that there's this the municipal council is stuck between a rock and a hard place. This sort of wedge where the value of the properties that they have to provide services for is completely out of balance with the value that they can tax.
Yeah. So municipalities, I think, are just extremely captured by an austerity mindset. The priority, the third rail, the no-go zone is raising property taxes.
And municipalities being creatures of the province, that's a tough place to start, isn't it?
Yeah. So there are these fiscal consequences where I do think it makes it harder. The province doesn't ask me if they want to raise my income tax when I get an inflationary raise every year. You just move up. And especially during COVID, we didn't even have indexed tax brackets, so it happens automatically. With the sales tax, it happens automatically.
Yes.
But with municipal politics, we have this idea that we need to keep tax bills as close to flat as possible, and so we've been cutting the tax rate instead of increasing it most years for the past decade.
So, in your opinion, what does something need to happen with this CAP in order to help the housing situation, or is there any movement there?
Well, I think if municipal politicians want to keep running an austerity program, I think that's wrong. I think it's bad. I think we're going to keep seeing the consequences: canceled ferries, striking library workers, all these sorts of signs that the city is falling apart because it can't raise money. But the more pressing problem now is the tax reset. What's happening is that whenever a new buyer comes to buy a property, they're not keeping that old property tax assessment.
They get the new one.
They get the official one.
So it's tougher to get in. Yep.
And the gap between the taxable rate or the taxable assessment and the actual assessment is so big that people are seeing 50, 60, 80%, even doubling of their tax bills. And those people are young buyers.
Right.
Primarily young buyers.
And at some point, you'd think this is the government's role, is to look at this and say, how do we set this country up on a sustainable manner so that the younger generation is not carrying the water for the older generation?
Yeah, I know, and
I mean, that's a gross generalization there, but
politicians of all stripes will say, we feel really bad about young people and renters in this housing crisis, and that should be our priority. And then they'll keep all of these rules on the books that are specifically targeting young people in very awful ways in order to save, a couple percentage points on the large mass of people, of established homeowners who have made hundreds of thousands of dollars on their properties, often tax-free. One funny contrast with California is Prop 13 is only about your principal residence.
Correct.
But in Nova Scotia, you can be a landlord and buy up as many of these properties, as long as they're 1 to 4 units, and have capped assessments on all of those. So people could basically have, tens of millions of dollars of sheltered, protected tax value in their properties.
So there's a place to start, perhaps. Make it only the primary residence.
That one's it's almost too easy.
It's probably been thought about.
But the province, I think, had tried to this in 2018. I think there's probably just a lot of fear that the situation has gone so off the rails that they're scared of the issue in general. But there are these very targeted changes that you could make that could help tremendously. I like the idea of making new buyers. If you're a first-time home buyer, you get to keep the taxable assessment.
Just the first one. Just the first time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In that way, you're just not putting these costs onto young people who are already stretching to buy places at high prices and with higher interest rates. We don't need the extra tax hit on top of that.
Yeah, so related, of course, to the housing issue is transportation, another big issue here in Halifax and in the HRM. You hear people that are from here complaining about how the traffic is getting worse. You sit in your car. What are we doing with buses? What are we doing with making the car walker-friendly? It sure seems that the provincial government, who came in on a groundswell, the two pieces I've heard from the provincial government in terms of transportation, they want to build more highways to dump more cars into the peninsula, and getting rid of the bridge tolls. Now, both of those seem to be a stress on an automobile culture, and seem to, at least in the short run and the mid-run, make the situation worse. Help me with this.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about, urban cores a bit differently from the rest of the province.
Right.
I've got no problem with twinning highways all over the place. It helps for safety. If there's enough traffic on it, go for it. But you get to this problem of you can build all the highways you want, but then it still needs to get onto the peninsula. And we're not building, it's not like we're going to do a Mexico City where we build double or triple decker elevated highways anytime soon.
Or other. What's interesting you mention that, because I was talking with somebody that knows of the bridges, And there was a discussion among staff that one possibility that the province would do is, now that there's no toll coming off the McKay Bridge, that a double-decker unit just goes over the Windsor Exchange, makes that whole issue moot, goes along Joe Howe, and ties in with 102. Now, when I heard that, I thought, oh my goodness, the United States tried this in the 70s and the 80s. There's a great book, Power Broker, where Robert Moses made New York into a car city. I lived in San Francisco, where there was this thing called the Embarcadero Freeway, which was a double-decker freeway along the waterfront.
Yeah.
And that was finally torn down, and it opened up all sorts of things. And I feel like, oh my goodness, I'm moving to this area that is seemingly progressive, and they're talking about building double-decker highways? What?
Yeah. I think it's a fine idea to separate the traffic on Windsor Street Exchange to allow people to get from the McKay Bridge to the Bedford Highway without hitting a traffic light.
Yeah, and that is it's so complicated with the port and everything.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there,
Yeah.
I know.
But we're still in this situation where we have the peninsula is what it is. It's a 1940. It's a very old grid network
It's
of
last
streets.
centuries. Yeah, it was built not for these big vehicles.
And so, this comes to the bridge tolls. I'm not, when you get rid of tolls, traffic goes up. It's that's very clear. I'm not worried about the bridges themselves. They're quite high capacity. But the problem is, on either side of the bridges, you have all of these choke points. North Street is only a single lane. And so you can put more traffic on the bridge, but once it hits North Street, once it hits Wise Road,
right,
it's a total bottleneck that could make the whole situation even worse. And that's what I think. Like people are very frustrated about traffic congestion, and I get that people also don't like tolls, but you can pay with your time or you can pay with your money. And the way I see it, $1 is not that much.
And economically, doesn't it make the most sense? As an economist, whoever's using the bridge, they pay for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it does set us up for a big question of, we've got a provincial government that's mostly from outside of Halifax, and that's very focused on the issue of healthcare, which requires huge sums of money.
Which is a big
and
need.
is not going away.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, 5 years down the road, when you get to that negotiation table or, the budget setting table, when are they ever going to find $2 billion to rebuild the McKay Bridge?
Which has to happen. That discussion needs to start soon.
Yeah, exactly. That's a political decision. I would love to see those decisions being made, because I don't see it happening. On the transportation front, we're already struggling to get bus rapid transit. As I understand it, the city is ready to do bus rapid transit. The feds have committed money for bus rapid transit.
Now, when you say bus rapid transit, what does that mean? What's that look like?
So basically, it's picking a few lines that go basically all across the city or most of the city, these major corridors.
That doesn't happen now?
And making a real commitment to say, we're going to provide reliable service. Type of every 15 minutes, every 10 minutes.
Okay. On the main core routes.
Yeah.
Right.
To the point where you don't need to check the timetable. You just go up to the bus station.
And a bus will show up. Well, most parts of the world, that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's a bunch of infrastructure changes along with that, more bus lanes.
Yeah.
And whatnot. But, we're having trouble finding our ferries. We can't develop buses. It's a real stalemate in terms of transportation, except maybe to your point on the highway building front, mostly outside of the urban core. That seems to be progressing. But the rest of it, for getting around inside the city, it's mostly looking like it'll get worse and worse every year.
Right. I'm convinced, moving to the city, that it's such an exciting time to be here. It's growing. There's more people from all over the place moving here. Yes, there's issues, but the city will figure it out. Now, how long that takes, and while you're living through that, it's difficult. As an economist, who knows Halifax. What questions would you have? Tomorrow I'm going to speak with one of the counselors on the HRM, and next week I'm going to have the opportunity to speak with the candidates for the open federal seat.
Yeah.
The one that was set up by Mr. Fillmore leaving. What questions should I be asking them?
Well, so municipally, to go municipally first, I like Laura. I think everybody agrees that the municipal government doesn't have money. Partially that's because of their making, but also it's just because of the way the system is made up.
Right.
But what they do is they have a lot of rules about what you can build and where you can build it. I'm surprised here that, we've got 2 fresh mandates in Nova Scotia, provincially and in the city. And, I think that the Housing Accelerator Fund will be successful, has already shown some signs of being effective. I'm surprised that despite all the energy about housing in these past elections, I don't see much of anything around housing. I see a lot of hopes, but I would especially want more housing near the universities and hospitals.
And do I have this right? Housing is primarily a provincial piece. The municipalities can't, or they're not in a position to initiate big programs. Is that right?
Well, they don't have any money.
Okay, so there you go. That's the beginning and the end of it.
They have a lot of rules about where you can build and what what you can build.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way they influence. That's the way they influence housing.
Yeah.
Of course, the province can always override anything the municipality does. They're a creature of the province.
That's in their purview.
So you could ask either if you had the mayor, he could change something, or the Minister of Housing, Colton LeBlanc, can change anything about housing with a stroke of a pen.
Yeah, the relationship between municipal and provincial here I find fascinating, because you have a city council that is standing upon the shoulders of the past council, where they've done a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of money has gone into planning for a city that is less car dependent. And then you have a province coming in that seemingly wants to make it more car dependent. That's an interesting situation.
Yeah. And, I can quibble a bit with that, making it less car dependent. I'm not sure that we're really doing that at all.
You don't think the council is dedicated?
I think they're saying words. But in the last census...
Well, look, the Windsor Exchange was shot down until busing was addressed.
Yeah.
That was one. And at the risk of having the province coming in and saying, okay, you voted it down, we'll take it over.
Yeah. I would just say, in the last census, one of the slowest growing areas of the city, one of the only areas of the city that shrank, was the deep south end, where the houses become really nice.
And this is where we need the density of housing.
That's where you could put people who don't need to drive to work, who can walk to work. And one of the fastest growing parts of the cities was over by Hammond's Plains, which is basically rural, where you're guaranteed to need to drive to work.
And there's space to grow, and yes.
And so the words are there, the reports are there, they look very nice. I'm not sure the set of policies actually add up to all that much.
I see. Interesting to hear you describe it as the deep South End. I haven't heard it described as that. I don't know if that's a thing, but I'm thinking of the deep South in the United States and comparing.
Maybe some similarities.
Yeah,
there's some mansions down there.
That's good. Now, how about for the federal candidates? What if you could ask them a question? And we're going to have each of the flavors.
Yeah. Well, so the feds have the money in this game. So they can show up with tens of billions of dollars if they wanted to and get into the game themselves. I think the Housing Accelerator Fund was hugely successful, dollar for dollar, especially here. It didn't work in other provinces because other cities are more nefarious on housing.
Other situations. Yeah.
But here it was a great success, and I'd hope to see any federal government building on that. And then there has to be, the feds control the border, the budget, and the banks. Okay. And so each of those tools, the border there's been a lot of changes done, and we're just kind of seeing those flow through. The budget, there's always more money you could spend and ways you could spend it more efficiently. And then the banks, you can always change these rules about banks to make it easier to lend on construction.
Right.
That's one of the problems about housing is it's really slow and it's really risky to build a project. And so in any way you can make that more feasible and more economic, it's always good.
And that would come from the federal
That would come from the
area,
federal, yeah.
Initially. Okay. Anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Great. Well, the last thing I'll ask you, Denny, that I ask all the guests, is tell us about a couple of books that you have read or are reading that are so good you'd like to pass on.
Yeah. So obviously trade is a huge topic right now. The problem with trade, speaking as an economist, is that it's just really complicated. Anything about international economics is really complicated.
Well, look at half of the individuals down south think that when a tariff gets placed, that's going to be paid for by the Canadians.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
Yeah, or that prices might go down for them.
Right.
But so there's a really good book that I like called Trade Wars or Class Wars by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis.
Mm-hmm.
And it really talks about how a lot of trade problems are really a reflection of domestic issues in economies. So this is all before the big trade war, Trump stuff, but it goes through China, Germany, and the U.S. as these big examples of where the global trade system is.
And who pays for these trade wars?
Yeah.
Right.
And then the other, I like reading about different countries. The other one's a bit of a fun one about a Brazilian sociologist in the 80s who accidentally found himself to be finance minister of Brazil during hyperinflation and then later became the president of Brazil.
Lula.
No, the president before Lula, Fernando Henrique Cardoso.
Okay,
FHC.
Yes. Okay.
So the book is called The Accidental President.
Okay.
And it's this really good casual history of Brazil coming out of the dictatorship and this chaotic time. And it's a great way to learn about Brazil and also a bit about economics.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for those, Denny, and those will be listed in the notes for this discussion for those of you that are interested. Well, Denny, thank you very much again for joining us. And as things develop, hope to have you back, and we'll take a look at how things are going.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Denny.